Hello, I'm Jaine, the Resilience Guide. Glad you could join me. I've decided that I'm going to share a more personal story because I'm quite often talking about you and how I can support you. Um, and I wanted to share a story that I first put pen to paper about a couple of years ago. And interestingly, I don't know how this is going to affect me, um, but this is the first time I've read it since. So I know it might be a little bit emotional. So it's a story that's featured in my book, Looking for Tigers, and Other Tales from Curious Places, which is a whole lot more than just a set of travel stories from some of the amazing countries and places that I've visited. It goes quite deep and quite personal. And perhaps if you read it, you would see that there were clues to the type of person I am today. So this is a story called Rebel, and I'm not going to tell you much about it in advance, but it's about a tragedy that happened to me many, many years ago when I was a young woman. And I'm going to read it out. Deep breath. In 1990, I met a man whose life and death became one of the single most defining things for me. I mentioned him briefly in earlier stories, but this is the first time I've ever written about him, and his tragedy still hurts today. But it's a story that I owe it to him to share. And this is the first time that I'm reading it out loud, and it's the first time I'm reading it at all since I wrote it. As a young woman, I had a string of relationships with men that ended badly. From the age of 15, I often dated men many years older than me, and when I was attracted to dangerous people. I have no doubt now, looking back, as to the cause of this, but that's not something I'm ready to write about. Perhaps the worst partner I chose was a man who beat me so badly that I was hospitalised. As I wrote previously, it was because of him that I fled all I knew in Bristol and headed for London with just a suitcase and the name of an employment agency where I had been told I might find work. I spent a couple of years in London before jacking in my job at Saatchi & Saatchi Advertising. I spent the summer of 1990 in Israel, my first bit of independent travelling, and arrived in Bath, which is in the West Country of England, in the September for yet another fresh start as an art student. I was still only 20 years old. One of the first things I did was to hook up with the better friends from Bristol, whose numbers I still knew. But on my very first day at college, I tried calling my friend Errol, a Bristol DJ I'd known for a number of years, only to be told by his mum that he had passed away. I knew that he was often ailing from sickle cell disease, but I knew little about the illness at the time, and I certainly wasn't prepared for his passing. Errol's mum told me where he was buried, and I made a rare trip back to Bristol to lay a rose on his grave. It was a grim return to living in the West Country, one that would turn out to be bookended by grief. In that first week, we met other students on the foundation art course. There were 25 of us in total, roughly. Simon was 5 years my senior, and we made friends right away. Well over 6 feet tall, with his hair cut in a low Mohican and white skin that tanned easily, he was already striking. Simon was passionate about animal rights, anti-racism and ska music. He spent his spare time going to gigs or sabotaging local fox hunts. He was also a screen printer and obsessed with images of fractals, which he printed onto t-shirts. He loved quirky animations and films. At that time, the art I was making was dark and troubled. Influenced by my time in Israel, it focused on war and conflict, and I enjoyed throwing off a kind of messed up artist vibe to whoever I encountered. I enjoyed being scruffy and not having to wear smart clothes to work anymore, and I really embraced student life. I lived in a filthy shared house. I drank and smoked too much, took on part-time jobs which never lasted, and had a shopping trolley in my bedroom. Definitely an art student. At one point, I even lived in a basement squat just off the famous circus in the most expensive part of the city. I attempted to have relationships with men, but nothing lasted very long. I would fall madly in love one week and then out of love the next, often leaving men behind a bit baffled and me feeling disappointed in myself again. Simon and I were very different people, but became very good friends. I didn't initially feel attracted to him, but we could talk together for hours about all sorts of things and laugh a lot, so we became close. He had a very steady girlfriend, much, much older than him, and a very old, grey, wolf-like dog called Rebel, who went everywhere with him, trailing a few steps behind and never on a lead. Rebel was his true love, and a familiar face in the communal rooms at the college. Everybody loved Rebel. The college itself was an old Georgian townhouse on Sydney Place and tucked away at the end of the grand Pulteney Road south that swept into the centre of Bath. The ceramics department was in the basement, painting studios on the first floors, and the art students had pokey studio spaces up many flights of stairs in the cramped attic rooms. We painted, photographed, designed, worked in concrete relief, and I made sculptures from things we'd found in bins and skips from around the town. I was probably the most creative and free I'd ever felt, but it all came crashing down at the end. Having left Israel as the Gulf War started rumbling and Scud missiles from Iraq started landing, I became a little obsessed with the place. I read lots about Mossad, about Holocaust, about the establishment of Israel, and I seriously considered a future in that part of the world. I had fallen in love with the Middle East over the summer, and once at art college I wouldn't shut up about it, nor stop making art about it. I wrote long letters to the many inspiring Israeli friends I had made there. I think some of the college mistook my passion for being anti-Palestinian, which couldn't be further from the truth. I was more about being pro-people than anti-anything, and have always had tremendous faith in the human spirit as being essentially kind, tolerant and loving. As I've previously written, it was interesting to note, a decade after my first visit to Israel, I spent a long weekend in Jordan and felt exactly the same spiritual instinct as I walked around the citadel in Amman at dusk. That confirmed for me that it wasn't just the adolescent obsessions of an art student. I really had a connection. Simon and I were very different art students. I was a little intense, had a shaky history with men, a passion for the Middle East, and was making some dark art about war. Simon was a very popular person, a race and animal rights activist with a unique dress sense. I guess our common ground was that in our hearts we were both humanitarians, and we both also had a level of disappointment with humans. I'm still not quite sure how or why we got together romantically. My memory is hazy, but I know it wasn't anything I had planned or intended. I think it was when a good friend and I became homeless. This was after the squat, and we ended up staying at his place, which was a small flat above a pet shop. Rebel the dog had sadly died of old age, and Simon split up with his long-term girlfriend, a relationship that most of us at college had witnessed as being quite volatile. Simon wasn't in a good place. The end of our course wasn't far away, and we were beginning to think about future plans. Just one day after our first kiss, Simon asked me to marry him. I was bowled over, felt that I was finally deeply in love, and completely unaware of the concept of rebound on his part. I had met someone as impulsive and nonconformist as me, and our longer-term friendship surely meant that he was a keeper. I said yes, of course, and we went to Bristol to tell my mum and stepfather, and then hitchhiked down to Cornwall to tell his parents. Everyone tried to talk us out of it, wondered why we were in such a hurry, why we both felt so sure of ourselves. But we were married at Bath Registry Office within a week of that kiss. Family gathered, dresses were bought, suits were hired, and my mum made a very impressive vegetarian buffet reception in her back garden in Bristol. We got permission to take a week off college for a honeymoon, and we hitchhiked all the way from Bath to Portugal, sleeping in the back of lorries, on beaches and in derelict houses. We made friends with a Basque truck driver called Perkins, who played in a punk band, and I witnessed Simon getting drunk for the first time in a dingy bar in Irun, northern Spain. It took us so long to make it to the Portuguese coast that once there we turned around and came straight back. But it was springtime, and we were young, and Europe was beautiful. We both took lots of silly, quirky photos and teased each other playfully. It was a huge whirlwind. We felt edgy, brave, and giddy, but I had no idea I was in the eye of a storm. The fire of our love burned brightly, but it also burned quickly. Along with the other students, once back in Bath, Simon and I enjoyed a fantastic end-of-course show. It was packed full of visitors, and we hired the real-life acting group to behave strangely and pose amongst them. No art was for sale, and I still much prefer making things that I give or throw away. Once the moment has passed, it allows for more creative freedom, not having to consider a commercial aspect to art. I remember Simon nearly passing out as he made a cast of his own head, neck and shoulders and painted it with green gloss paint. I filled my attic studio space with sand, blasted out Killing an Arab by The Cure, and installed a fake dead soldier on a shelf with blood dripping down the walls and across my paintings and into the sand. Back then I hadn't even read The Outsider by Albert Camus, so I had completely missed the meaning behind the song. My paintings were of naked women holding guns. It certainly was challenging, but also naive and probably deeply offensive. Before I got together with Simon, my plans, once college had finished in June, were to travel, starting with a visit to Lithuania with the Quakers for a voluntary environmental project, building footpaths. I was raising money for the trip by drawing people's houses for them. But at that time, the Iron Curtain was in the midst of falling, and as the grip of the Soviet Empire loosened across Europe, Lithuania momentarily became a country not advised to travel to. I had already bought tickets, which the travel agency refused to refund. However, I could swap them to another destination. There was really only one place I wanted to go at short notice, and that was back to Israel. Simon and I had moved into a one-bedroom flat in Bedminster, back in my hometown of Bristol. I was in two minds about moving back there, my last experience of Bristol being so negative, culminating in a domestic assault. But Simon loved the place and had found work there at a screen printer's before we got together. Although he was born in Singapore, Simon had been raised in North Yorkshire, and Bristol, for him, was an exciting new city. We spent a lot of time exploring the place together, me acting as a kind of tour guide, but also seeing my hometown through fresh eyes. Simon especially liked the Clifton area and knew it best. He had spent time there at nearby Aardman animation workshops, helping out with the development of their Creature Comfort series. It was in 1991 when I waved goodbye to Simon and flew back to Israel to spend a few weeks as a guest at the kibbutz I had previously been to. I understand now that I was still very much looking for the next adventure in my life. After just 4 months of marriage, the spark had started to fade, and although I loved Simon like a friend, I knew then it wasn't going to work in the long term. A momentary escape back to a country I had romanticised over for the past year helped me to see that. Whilst there, I re-established relationships with a friend I had been writing to, including with a deeply troubled Israeli man who very much respected the fact that I was now a married woman. He, like many others, was a bit baffled by my decision to get married after knowing someone for just a week, and I too began to see the folly in this. By the time I returned to the UK, I had more or less decided that my future lay in the Middle East. I had been seduced again by the entrancing land and by the people and their stories, and possibly by the deeply troubled Israeli man who had behaved so admirably. Simon had spent most of the time I was away with his parents in Cornwall, and had lost his wedding ring in the sea, which he saw as an omen. On my return, we spent a day and a night talking about how we felt about our futures, about how and why we married so quickly. Simon was still in many ways grieving for his dog Rebel and his previous relationship. I should mention that not long after we got together, I discovered his ex-girlfriend standing in our bathroom with a baseball bat in her hand, ready to mess us up. It was not an easy relationship for him to come out of, let alone move on to me so quickly. We spoke about our feelings very honestly. We cried a lot, we hugged a lot, we both felt in a very low place. We talked a lot about suffering, how life appeared to be an endless, exhausting roller coaster of joy and pain. We even spoke about ending it all and discussed how we might do it. There was even an unlikely romantic notion that we might take our lives together. Aged 21, I felt confused and lost, and when Simon ran out the door, I was very, very afraid. I phoned 999 immediately and told the police that I feared Simon may take his own life. I had broken his heart, I knew. They put me in the back of a police car and drove me around Bristol looking for him. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. Bristol was a big city. Although far from Bedminster, I told the police officers to focus on the Clifton area. I knew he loved the suspension bridge. Together with them, we visited the bridge and warned the staff at the toll booth to be on the lookout for Simon. He wasn't easy to miss, a 6-foot male with a Mohican haircut and a bright pink fractal on his shirt. The police told me the best thing to do was to wait at home, which is what I did. I waited all night, in silence, until the heavy knock on the door at dawn told me the news I dreaded the most. At the age of 21, after just a few months of marriage, I was asked to identify my husband's body. His remains had been found underneath the Clifton Suspension Bridge. His body was surprisingly intact after such a fall. I was told that his heart had stopped beating long before he landed. The police gave me a crumpled suicide note he had on him, which I carried in my purse for 10 years. My life changed in an instant. I completely crashed. I felt suffocated by everyone around me, by my unsatisfactory life thus far, by my family, by Bristol. I hated everything, but the hatred I held for myself was top of the list. I climbed to high places and considered doing the same on many occasions. Simon's father screamed out at me at the funeral that I was a murderer, and that was how I felt for at least the next decade, until I could finally get some help. And in the early days, I had so much guilt. I didn't feel I deserved counselling. I was very, very hard on myself. After the funeral, in a bit of a daze, I did go to Israel. I felt I owed it to Simon in a funny sort of way to give it a go. I continued to climb up on high places even there. I made more darker art and scared people a bit. As I mentioned in earlier stories, I worked alongside people who suffered far more than I, and I surrounded myself with the elderly people of the kibbutz. These were Auschwitz survivors, those with tattoos on their arms who had lost all their loved ones or had spent the war hiding in forests. Being with them ensured I could never, ever feel sorry for my own plight. I wore my guilt like a scar and vowed that I would never act again without considering the feelings of another. I would never, ever put my own joy and freedom ahead of anyone's feelings. In December, close to Christmas, I attempted to scrape my life back together and make a few gestures of purpose that I knew Simon would approve of. I rescued a little ginger kitten who was stuck up a tree in a storm, and I named him Rebel. I also fed 20 other stray cats. I looked after some horses, and I resumed being vegetarian. I spoke to Simon out loud every day, often to apologise, and I still do sometimes. In Israel, I started to learn Ivrit, modern Hebrew. Although the old man that taught me was a bit inappropriate, I remember him putting a lot of focus on learning the parts of the body, including Evre Min, which means private parts. I tried to learn Arabic too, something I've tried and failed to do throughout my life. I also studied Arab-Israeli coexistence at a wonderful place called Givat Reviva and went on to big peace rallies in Tel Aviv. It was the beginning of a more considerate life for me. Things never worked out with the deeply troubled Israeli man. I wasn't in a very good place for much, really, but I did meet my second husband in Israel many months later. As I've written before, Peter was a South African, and we travelled together for over a year before we married in secret to prevent him having to go back to South African military under apartheid. I only told my family that we had previously got married when I fell pregnant with my first child. We didn't have a buffet in my mum's garden, but we stayed together for 14 years. I was too scared to end it for fear of history repeating itself. I haven't been back to Israel since Peter and I sailed away from Haifa on a boat in 1993. That is over 30 years ago now. After I left, I learned that Rebel the cat had been bitten by a dog and broken his leg, yet more guilt to carry. It has taken too many years to forgive myself for the part in Simon's death. 3 decades later, and I'm still being tested. After COVID closed our business, I first found work as a 999 call handler for Avon and Somerset Police before moving on to another police force and another job. By answering emergency calls, I discovered the extraordinary number of people that contemplate suicide at the Clifton Suspension Bridge in Bristol, and just how many still succeed in ending their own lives. My story is sadly not unique, and it's perhaps for the families who have experienced this tragedy that I share this story, although it really pains me to do so. I'm hoping that it can show you that you're not alone with your feelings, especially feelings of guilt that can paralyse you after the trauma of someone close taking their own life. It may forever define you, but don't leave it 10 years before you seek help. That was difficult to read. And the pain and the loss, even though I've had therapy and, I know myself so much better, I am and always will be, I think, on a path to healing and a path of forgiving myself, because I don't think I'll ever be completely there. You wear the scars for a long time. This is one of the reasons why I care so deeply for charities that support both families that have survived someone who's taken their own life, but also in mental health, in particular men's mental health, because let's face it, Simon at the age of 26 was absolutely of the age where young men do take their own lives. So thank you very much for listening. I'm not sure if that's re-traumatised you or helped you. I can promise you that the rest of the stories in my book are not quite as sad as that. They're more uplifting, but they're no less meaningful. Thank you again. I look forward to hearing your comments and thoughts.